a man who lost his leg and hand. For 22 years, his wife stood beside him. They built a home, raised kids, survived the kind of storms only long marriages understand. And then, without warning, he left her. For a woman the same age as their daughter. Someone his daughter once trusted with sleepovers and secrets. He treated the new relationship like a prize, traveling across continents, posting pictures, living the adventure he said he always wanted. But when the accident happened, a crash so violent it killed an innocent couple and left him without a leg and a hand, his new wife didn't hold his broken body the way he imagined. She abandoned him on the hospital bed before the anesthesia even faded. The woman he threw away for her? The wife he betrayed? She came back, not for reconciliation, but because she refused to let the father of her children die alone. What he didn't know yet, as investigators pieced through the wreckage, was that the accident wasn't an accident. And as investigators began asking questions, the story took a direction no one expected. Not even him. Welcome to True Crime Story HQ. Thanks to all my viewers and subscribers for your support. Stay tuned for daily true crime updates. Don't forget to subscribe. Raymond Allen Patterson came into this world on a cold November morning in 1966 in Eugene, Oregon. He was the second of 3 sons born to a long-haul truck driver named Earl and a school secretary named Dorothy. His childhood wasn't glamorous, and it wasn't easy, but it taught him something that would define the first half of his life. Stability is something you build with your own 2 hands. His father was gone more than he was home, hauling freight across state lines, while Dorothy held the family together with organizational precision and a quiet strength that never wavered. Raymond watched his mother stretch paychecks, manage 3 boys alone, and never once complain about the hand she'd been dealt. By the time he was old enough to understand what sacrifice looked like, he had already decided he would be the kind of man people could count on. He wasn't the smartest kid in his class at South Eugene High School. His grades were average, his athletic abilities unremarkable. But what Raymond Patterson lacked in natural talent, he made up for in persistence. He was the kid who stayed late, who showed up early, who finished what he started even when everyone else had gone home. His teachers wrote the same thing on every report card. Raymond tries harder than anyone else in this classroom. That work ethic carried him to the University of Oregon, where he earned a degree in business administration while working 30 hours a week at a landscaping company. By the time he walked across that graduation stage in 1988, he had already started his own business out of the back of a rusted pickup truck his father had given him as a graduation gift. Patterson Landscape Services began with Raymond, a lawnmower, and a Yellow Pages ad. Within 4 years, he had 6 employees, 3 commercial contracts, and a reputation as the most reliable landscaper in the Portland metropolitan area. People who knew him during those early years all described him the same way: dependable. Raymond Patterson showed up when he said he would, charged what he quoted, and never cut corners. He wasn't flashy, he wasn't particularly charming, but he was solid, and in a world full of people who made promises they couldn't keep, solid meant everything. That was exactly what Diane Marie Holloway was looking for when she met him at a 4th of July barbecue in the summer of 1991. Diane came from different circumstances than Raymond. She had grown up in Lake Oswego, an affluent suburb south of Portland, where the lawns were manicured and the futures were predetermined. Her father was a dentist with a successful practice. Her mother sold luxury real estate. Diane had options that Raymond had never even dreamed of, including a modest trust fund and an acceptance letter to law school that sat unopened on her desk for 3 months. But Diane had spent her teenage years watching her parents' marriage dissolve in slow motion. The silent dinners where no one spoke. The separate vacations disguised as business trips. The performative affection at holiday gatherings that fooled no one, least of all their daughter. By the time her parents finally divorced during her junior year of college, Diane had already decided what she didn't want. A marriage built on appearances, on status, on the kind of empty success that looked good in Christmas cards, but felt hollow everywhere else. She wanted something real, something that would last. Raymond spilled beer on her white sneakers at that barbecue. He was mortified, apologizing profusely while trying to dab at the stain with a napkin. Diane laughed instead of getting angry. "They're just shoes," she said. "Tell me your name instead." By Labor Day, they were inseparable. By Christmas, Raymond had met her parents and held his own despite their obvious disappointment that their daughter was dating a landscaper. By Valentine's Day, he had proposed with a ring he couldn't afford, purchased on a payment plan he would spend 2 years paying off. They married on March 14, 1992, in a small ceremony at Diane's parents' church in Lake Oswego. 53 guests attended. Daffodils decorated every table because Diane's grandmother had grown them in her garden, and Diane wanted something of her grandmother's memory present on the happiest day of her life. Raymond's vows were simple, delivered in a voice that shook with emotion. "I will never leave you. I will never stop working to give you the life you deserve, and I will spend every day grateful that you chose me." 22 years later, those words would echo in a divorce filing, twisted into a cruel irony that neither of them could have imagined on that spring afternoon. The Pattersons spent their first decade of marriage building everything they had dreamed of. Raymond's landscaping company expanded into property management, acquiring rental properties throughout the Portland area. Diane earned her real estate license and began flipping houses before flipping houses became a cable television phenomenon. Together, they were formidable, a team that complemented each other's strengths and compensated for each other's weaknesses. Raymond handled the operations, Diane handled the finances. And somewhere in between, they found time to become parents. Their daughter Megan was born in September 1993, a healthy 8 pounds, 2 ounces, with her mother's eyes and her father's stubborn streak. Their son Derek followed 2 years later, in November 1995, quieter than his sister but just as determined. By the year 2002, the Patterson family had everything the American dream promised: a 4-bedroom craftsman home in the West Hills neighborhood of Portland, owned outright with no mortgage, 2 healthy children excelling in school, annual vacations to the Oregon coast, Memorial Day barbecues where neighbors gathered in their backyard and commented on how lucky Raymond and Diane were to have found each other. From the outside, they were the couple everyone wanted to be. But even the strongest foundations develop cracks over time. And inside the Patterson home, hairline fractures had already begun to form, invisible to everyone except the 2 people who lived there. Raymond had started making comments about routine, about predictability, about feeling like his life had become a series of obligations rather than choices. Diane noticed but dismissed it as midlife restlessness, the kind of thing that passed with time. She would spend years replaying those early warning signs, wishing she had paid closer attention to what her husband was becoming. But before we continue this story, make sure you've hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Trust me, you're going to want to see where this goes. Because the cracks in the Patterson marriage weren't the only things growing. Across town, in a neighborhood the Pattersons had never visited, a little girl named Brittany Collins was about to enter their lives and change everything forever. Brittany Lynn Collins entered the world on a rainy November evening in 1996, born to a 19-year-old mother named Linda, who had dropped out of community college 3 months earlier when the pregnancy test came back positive. Linda worked as a cashier at a grocery store on Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard, earning minimum wage and struggling to pay rent on a 2-bedroom apartment above a laundromat that rattled the windows every time the machines ran their spin cycles. Brittany's father was a man named Doug Wheeler, 22 years old and already showing signs of the man he would become. He stuck around long enough to sign the birth certificate, then disappeared before Brittany's first birthday, never to be heard from again. The apartment where Brittany spent her early childhood was cramped and poorly heated, with water stains on the ceiling and neighbors who fought loudly enough to wake her most nights. Linda did her best, working double shifts and leaving her daughter with a rotating cast of relatives, neighbors, and sometimes no one at all. But doing your best and doing enough are not always the same thing. By the time Brittany was old enough to understand her circumstances, she had already learned the most important lesson of her young life. Survival required strategy. The world didn't give you what you deserved. It gave you what you could take. Child psychologists who would later analyze Brittany's behavior patterns traced her manipulation skills back to these formative years. She learned early how to read a room, how to identify who held power and who could be useful, how to become whatever someone else needed her to be in order to get what she wanted. She learned that charm could unlock doors that money couldn't. By the age of 8, Brittany Collins had developed an almost preternatural ability to adapt, to perform, to make adults believe she was exactly the sweet, innocent child they wanted to see. It was a survival mechanism, born of necessity. But survival mechanisms have a way of becoming something else entirely when circumstances change. In 2002, Linda Collins managed to scrape together enough money to move to a marginally better apartment in a marginally better school district. This meant Brittany transferred to a new elementary school in the middle of 3rd grade, walking into a classroom full of strangers with nothing but her charm and her instincts. She spotted Megan Patterson on the first day, a girl with clean clothes and a new backpack, and the kind of easy confidence that comes from never having worried about whether dinner would be on the table. Brittany sat next to her at lunch, complimented her shoes, and asked if she wanted to be friends. Megan thought Brittany was funny and fearless, the kind of friend who made every day an adventure. Brittany thought Megan was her ticket to a different life. The two girls became inseparable almost immediately, their friendship transcending the vast differences in their backgrounds. Megan had piano lessons and summer camp and parents who checked her homework every night. Brittany had a mother who sometimes forgot to buy groceries and a wardrobe assembled entirely from thrift stores and hand-me-downs. But in the uncomplicated world of 9-year-olds, none of that seemed to matter. They passed notes in class. They invented secret languages. They swore they would be best friends forever, the way children do before they learn that forever is a promise the world rarely keeps. The first time Brittany visited the Patterson home, she was 10 years old. Linda dropped her off for a sleepover, barely glancing at the house before driving away in her rusted Honda Civic. Brittany stood in the entryway and took in everything, counting the rooms she could see. Living room with a leather couch, dining room with a table big, enough for 8. A kitchen with an island and stainless steel appliances. A staircase leading up to what she assumed were multiple bedrooms and bathrooms. Her entire apartment could have fit inside their living room. Diane Patterson greeted Brittany with a warm hug and a plate of homemade cookies. "We're so glad you're here, sweetie," she said. "Megan talks about you all the time." Brittany smiled and complimented the daffodils in the garden, remembering from somewhere that adults liked it when children noticed details. Diane thought she was delightful, already planning to include this polite, observant girl in future family outings. She had no idea she was welcoming her own replacement into her home. For the next 6 years, Brittany became a fixture in the Patterson household. She slept over on weekends, attended birthday parties, joined family vacations to the Oregon coast. She sat at their dinner table and absorbed everything. How Raymond discussed his business deals, how Diane managed the household budget, how money moved through their lives like water, endless and unremarkable. She watched the Pattersons the way a student watches a textbook, memorizing the details of a life she intended to claim for herself someday. Diane treated Brittany like a second daughter, filling the gaps that Linda's chaotic parenting left open. She bought Brittany school supplies when Linda forgot. She drove her to doctor's appointments when Linda couldn't take time off work. She included her in Christmas photos, bought her birthday presents, told her she was always welcome, that this was her home too. Diane's kindness was genuine, rooted in maternal instinct and the belief that every child deserved stability. She never suspected that Brittany was cataloging each act of generosity, filing it away for future reference. By the time Brittany entered high school, the awkward child who had once worn hand-me-downs had transformed into something else entirely. She was beautiful in a way that drew immediate attention, tall and athletic with sharp features and a smile that promised secrets. Boys noticed her. Teachers favored her. Track coaches began calling about scholarships, recognizing raw talent that could have taken her anywhere she wanted to go. But Brittany had already decided that athletic scholarships were for people who didn't have better options. She wasn't interested in earning success. She was interested in taking it. She had spent years watching her mother grow old before her time, watching the years of hard work leave Linda exhausted and alone with nothing to show for it. Brittany looked at her own reflection and understood that her beauty was a currency with a limited exchange rate. Every year that passed depreciated its value. She didn't have time to work her way up. She needed a shortcut. Raymond Patterson started looking at Brittany differently when she was 15. She noticed immediately the way his eyes lingered a half-second too long, the way he found reasons to be in the room when she visited. She filed that information away too, not acting on it, not yet, but understanding that it might prove useful someday. By the time she turned 18 in November 2011, Brittany Collins had already begun to formulate a plan. She enrolled in community college instead of accepting the university offers that came her way, a decision that puzzled everyone who knew her potential. But Brittany understood something they didn't. Community college kept her in Portland. It kept her close to Megan. It kept her close to the Patterson family. It kept her close to Raymond. What happened next would take 2 more years to unfold, but the seeds had already been planted, waiting for the right moment to bloom into something that would destroy everything the Pattersons had built. And Raymond Patterson, so focused on his own growing dissatisfaction, never saw it coming. The year Raymond Patterson turned 42, something inside him began to shift. It wasn't dramatic, not at first. No explosive arguments, no obvious betrayals, just a gradual erosion of satisfaction, a quiet voice whispering that life had somehow become smaller than he had expected. He had spent 2 decades building exactly what he thought he wanted: a successful business, a comfortable home, a family that looked perfect in photographs. But standing in the middle of everything he had created, Raymond felt strangely empty. The achievement he had chased for so long tasted nothing like he had imagined. By 2008, the Pattersons had settled into a rhythm that felt less like partnership and more like routine. Raymond woke at 6, went to the gym, arrived at the office by 8. Diane handled the household, managed the rental properties, shuttled the kids to their various activities. They ate dinner together most nights, but the conversations had become transactional, revolving around schedules and logistics rather than dreams and desires. When was the last time they had talked about something that mattered? Raymond couldn't remember. When was the last time they had laughed together, really laughed? He couldn't remember that either. He began comparing his life to the lives of other men he knew. Business associates who had traded their first wives for younger women and seemed energized by the change. Golf buddies who took trips without their families and came back with stories that made Raymond feel like he was missing something essential. Friends who seemed to have escaped the gravitational pull of responsibility while he remained trapped in orbit, circling the same predictable patterns day after day. Raymond told himself he deserved more. He had worked hard. He had provided. And what had he gotten in return? A wife who reminded him about dentist appointments. Children who barely looked up from their phones when he entered the room. A house that felt more like a museum of his past than a home. Diane noticed the change, though she struggled to name it. The man who used to bring her coffee every morning now left for the gym before she woke up. The man who used to plan elaborate anniversary dinners now forgot their anniversary entirely, remembering only when she mentioned it 2 days later with hurt in her voice. He apologized, promised to make it up to her, and then forgot that promise too. She tried to address it directly, suggesting couples therapy, suggesting a vacation just the two of them, asking point blank if something was wrong. Raymond's answer was always the same. "I'm fine. I'm just tired." Diane wanted to believe him. Believing him was easier than confronting what she already suspected, that her husband was slipping away from her, and she didn't know how to pull him back. Their children noticed the growing distance too, though they processed it differently. Megan, now in her late teens and preparing for college, made occasional comments about how her parents seemed to exist in separate orbits. "You and Dad never talk anymore," she observed one evening while helping Diane prepare dinner. "Like, really talk. About actual things." Diane changed the subject, uncomfortable with how clearly her daughter could see what she was trying to ignore. Derek, quieter than his sister and less inclined to probe emotional wounds, simply withdrew further into his own world, spending hours in his room with his video games and his music, avoiding the tension that had become impossible to miss. Meanwhile, Raymond had discovered something that made him feel alive again. Attention. Not from his wife, whose attention he had long since taken for granted, but from other sources. He started going to the gym obsessively, transforming his body with a dedication he hadn't shown anything in years. He bought new clothes, updated his hairstyle, traded his practical sedan for a sportier model. When women at business events noticed these changes, when they complimented his appearance or laughed at his jokes, Raymond felt something he hadn't felt in decades. He felt seen. He felt desired. He felt like the man he had always believed he could be, instead of the man he had become. Brittany Collins was 20 years old when she began her campaign in earnest. She had graduated from community college with an associate's degree she had no intention of using, maintaining her friendship with Megan, while quietly positioning herself closer to Megan's father. She stopped by the Patterson house under various pretenses, knowing that Megan was often at class or at her part-time job. Raymond was frequently home, working from his study or taking calls on the back porch. Diane was usually showing houses or managing the rental properties, absent for hours at a time. Brittany's approach was surgical in its precision. She didn't throw herself at Raymond, didn't make obvious advances that could be easily rejected or reported back to Megan. Instead, she made herself indispensable. She listened to his complaints about work with genuine interest. She asked questions about his business that made him feel like his expertise mattered. She laughed at his jokes, touched his arm when making a point, held eye contact a beat longer than necessary. She became a mirror that reflected the man Raymond wanted to be: interesting, successful, desirable. Raymond told himself it was harmless. Brittany was his daughter's friend, practically family. The fact that she sought out his company simply meant she was mature for her age, someone who appreciated adult conversation. The fact that being around her made him feel 20 years younger was just a pleasant side effect. He ignored the warning signals his conscience sent, rationalized away the inappropriate thoughts that crept in during quiet moments, convinced himself that nothing was actually happening. By the summer of 2013, Raymond Patterson had spent months lying to himself. The accidental encounters with Brittany had become scheduled meetings. The professional conversations had turned personal, then intimate, then something else entirely. Raymond knew he was standing at the edge of a cliff. He knew that one more step would send him plummeting into something he could never undo. He jumped anyway. The affair began in July 2013. Raymond was 47 years old, married for 21 years, the father of 2 children who trusted him completely. Brittany was 20, the same age as his daughter, a woman he had watched grow up in his own home. The details of how it started remained murky, with neither participant ever fully honest about who initiated what. But by August, there was no ambiguity left. Raymond Patterson was sleeping with his daughter's best friend, and for 6 months Diane Patterson had no idea her marriage was already over. Where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments below. And if you've made it this far, type "I'm still here," so I know who's still watching this unfold. Because what Raymond didn't realize, as he fell deeper into his affair with Brittany, was that she was playing a game he didn't even know existed. The afternoon Megan Patterson's world collapsed began like any other Tuesday. She had a break between nursing classes at Portland State University and needed a textbook she had left in her childhood bedroom during a weekend visit. Her mother was at work, showing properties on the east side of the city. Her father was supposed to be at the office, managing his landscaping crews and handling client meetings. The house would be empty, a quick in-and-out errand before her afternoon lecture. She used her key to unlock the front door, stepping into the familiar entryway that still smelled faintly of the lavender candles her mother favored. The house was silent. That particular kind of quiet that settles over empty spaces in the middle of the day. Megan climbed the stairs to her old bedroom, found the textbook on her desk where she had left it, and was heading back down when she heard something that stopped her, in her tracks. Voices, coming from down the hall, from her parents' bedroom. Megan's first thought was confusion. Was her mother home after all? Had her father come back early from work? She moved toward the sound without thinking, driven by curiosity rather than suspicion. The door to her parents' bedroom was slightly ajar. She pushed it open. What Megan Patterson saw in that moment would reshape the rest of her life. Her father was in bed. The woman with him was not her mother. The woman with him was Brittany Collins, her best friend since 3rd grade, the girl she had shared secrets with, the girl she had trusted with everything. Time seemed to stop. Megan stood frozen in the doorway, her brain struggling to process what her eyes were showing her. Brittany looked up first, and the expression on her face was something Megan would never forget. Not shock, not embarrassment, not guilt. It was something closer to satisfaction, a flicker of triumph that disappeared almost as quickly as it appeared. Raymond scrambled for the sheets, his face cycling through emotions too fast to track. Shock, then shame, then something that looked almost like anger at being caught. "Megan," he said, his voice cracking on her name. "This isn't... I can explain." But there was nothing to explain. Nothing that could make this moment anything other than what it was. Megan didn't scream. She didn't cry. She simply turned and walked away, down the stairs, out the front door, into her car. She drove 3 miles to a parking lot behind a grocery store and sat there for 2 hours, staring at nothing, trying to find a way to fit this new reality into the life she thought she knew. When she finally called her mother, her voice was flat, emptied of emotion. "Mom, you need to come home. There's something you need to know." Diane arrived at the house 45 minutes later. By then, Raymond had dressed and was waiting in the living room, rehearsing explanations that would never be adequate. Brittany had slipped out the back door, leaving no trace of her presence except the devastation she had caused. The conversation that followed was, by Raymond's own later admission, the worst of his life. Diane didn't yell. She didn't throw things. She didn't collapse into hysterics the way he might have expected. Instead, she asked questions in a calm, methodical voice that was somehow more devastating than any amount of screaming. "How long?" she asked first. Raymond told her 7 months. "Who is she?" Diane asked next. Raymond hesitated, and his hesitation told Diane everything she needed to know. "Brittany," she said, not a question anymore. "Brittany Collins, the girl I drove to her mother's funeral when Linda died last year, the girl I bought prom dresses for, the girl who ate Christmas dinner at our table. That Brittany." Raymond had no defense. There was no defense for what he had done. Diane's face changed as the full weight of his betrayal registered, the color draining away and then returning in a flush that wasn't anger, but something deeper and more final. Disgust. The friendship between Megan and Brittany ended that day. 15 years of shared history erased in a single afternoon. They never spoke again after Megan walked out of that bedroom. In interviews years later, Megan would describe the loss of Brittany as almost more painful than her father's betrayal. She had always known on some level that her father was emotionally distant, that his love came with conditions and limitations. But Brittany had been her confidant, her sister in every way that mattered. "The hardest part," Megan said, "was realizing she had never really been my friend. I was just her way in. I was her access point to my family, and once she didn't need me anymore, I was nothing to her." 3 weeks after Diane discovered the affair, Raymond filed for divorce. Not because Diane asked him to. She was still in shock, still processing, still trying to understand how the man she had loved for over 2 decades had become someone she didn't recognize. Raymond filed because Brittany demanded it. She had spent 7 months waiting in the shadows, and she had no intention of remaining hidden any longer. She wanted the house. She wanted the status. She wanted the legitimacy of being Mrs. Patterson. And Raymond, intoxicated by what he believed was love, gave her everything she asked for. Diane didn't fight the divorce. Her attorney advised her to demand a larger settlement, to drag out the proceedings, to make Raymond pay for his betrayal in the only language he seemed to understand anymore: money. She refused. "I don't want his money," she told her lawyer. "I want him to live with his choice. I want him to see what he gave up." She accepted a fair split of their assets. She kept the family home where she had raised her children. She signed the papers when they came, dry-eyed and steady-handed, and she let Raymond go, believing that the universe would eventually balance the scales. She had no idea how prophetic that belief would prove to be. The divorce was finalized in December 2014. Raymond moved into a downtown condominium with Brittany, who had already redecorated it with furniture purchased on his credit card. Diane spent that Christmas with Megan and Derek, the three of them eating dinner in the house that now felt too large, too quiet, too full of memories that hurt to remember. When the ball dropped on New Year's Eve, Diane made a resolution. She would not let this destroy her. She would rebuild. She would move forward. She would become someone stronger than the woman Raymond had left behind. What she didn't know was that Raymond's choices were about to catch up with him in ways none of them could have imagined, and the woman he had chosen over his family was already planning something far worse than betrayal. Raymond Patterson married Brittany Collins in a destination ceremony in Maui on December 19, 2015, 14 months after his divorce was finalized. The wedding was small by design, partly because Raymond wanted something intimate, and partly because most of the people who mattered in his life had refused to attend. His business partners made excuses. His siblings sent polite regrets. His children didn't respond at all. Derek's reply to the invitation was a single text message. "I can't watch this." Megan never acknowledged receiving hers. The ceremony took place on a private beach at sunset, with a dozen guests watching as Raymond slipped a 3-carat diamond ring onto Brittany's finger. She wore white, which some of the attendees found ironic under the circumstances. Raymond wore a linen suit and the smile of a man who believed he had finally found happiness after decades of settling for contentment. In his vows, he promised to spend the rest of his life making Brittany feel cherished, protected, loved. He meant every word. Brittany's vows were shorter, but no less convincing. She spoke of finding her soulmate, of knowing from the moment they connected that he was the man she was meant to be with. What she didn't mention was that the connection she referred to had been carefully engineered over years of observation and planning, that the love she professed was really something closer to acquisition. The first year of their marriage unfolded like a fantasy brought to life. Raymond, freed from the constraints of his previous existence, threw himself into the adventure he claimed he had always wanted. They traveled constantly. Vancouver first, then London, then Sydney, then Bali. Raymond spent money he had carefully accumulated over decades, justifying each expense as compensation for the years he had spent, trapped in a life that didn't fulfill him. Business-class flights, 5-star hotels, dinners that cost more than some families spent on groceries in a month. Brittany documented every moment on social media with the dedication of someone building a brand. Sunset photos from Sydney Harbor with champagne glasses tilted toward the camera, infinity pools overlooking rice terraces in Ubud, first-class lounges with her feet propped on designer luggage. Her Instagram followers watched as she transformed from Megan Patterson's friend into Raymond Patterson's wife, living a life that seemed plucked from a magazine spread. What she didn't post were the arguments that had already begun behind closed doors. Raymond's wealth, while substantial by Portland standards, was not unlimited. His landscaping and property management business had made him comfortable, but comfortable and extravagant are not the same thing. The trips Brittany demanded, the clothes she purchased, the lifestyle she expected, were draining resources faster than Raymond had anticipated. Within 18 months of their marriage, he had liquidated one of his rental properties to fund their adventures. He had maxed out a credit card he had never carried a balance on before. He had borrowed against his business, something he swore he would never do. And still, Brittany wanted more. The problem with building a relationship on fantasy is that reality inevitably intrudes. Brittany had imagined marriage to Raymond as a permanent vacation, an endless flow of first-class travel and designer purchases, and the attention that comes from being married to a successful older man. What she got was a 50-year-old man with bad knees who increasingly wanted to stay home on weekends, who worried about quarterly reports and client retention, who couldn't understand why the trips they had taken weren't enough. Brittany had miscalculated. Raymond wasn't as wealthy as she had assumed during all those years of observation. His assets were tied up in properties and businesses that required his constant attention. The money she had expected to flow freely actually came with conditions, with questions, with the kind of financial scrutiny that made her feel controlled rather than cared for. By the summer of 2016, the fantasy had begun to curdle into resentment. Raymond, meanwhile, had started questioning his own choices, though his pride prevented him from admitting it to anyone, including himself. He missed his children in a way that surprised him with its intensity. Derek hadn't spoken to him in over a year. Megan had sent exactly one communication since the divorce, a Christmas card with no personal message, just her signature in her familiar handwriting. He had traded his family for a woman who seemed to love his credit card more than she loved him, and the realization sat heavy in his chest during the sleepless hours of early morning. But Raymond Patterson was not a man who admitted mistakes. He had built his entire identity on decisiveness, on commitment, on seeing things through even when they became difficult. He had made his choice. He would live with it. He would learn to love this life he had chosen. He just didn't know how short that life would be. If you're enjoying this story, take a moment to like this video, subscribe if you haven't already, and share it with someone you care about. Because understanding how these situations unfold might protect someone you love from making the same devastating mistakes. Back in Portland, while Raymond was trying to convince himself that his new marriage would work, the woman he had left behind was quietly rebuilding, and his new wife was about to meet someone who would change everything. The gym where Brittany Collins Patterson met Tyler James Reeves was an upscale fitness center in downtown Portland, the kind of place with eucalyptus towels in the locker rooms and cold-pressed juice at the smoothie bar. Brittany had started coming there as an escape from the increasingly claustrophobic walls of her marriage, a place where she could sweat out her frustrations and remind herself that she was still young, still beautiful, still capable of attracting attention from men who didn't complain about their lower back pain or fall asleep by 9:00. Tyler was working as a personal trainer, supplementing his hourly wage with online courses toward a degree he would never complete. He was 24 years old, handsome in a rough-edged way that suggested he had lived more life than his years would indicate. His charm was effortless, the kind that comes from understanding exactly how attractive you are and deploying that knowledge strategically. He had a criminal record, minor charges mostly, theft convictions that had resulted in probation, and one assault case that had been pleaded down to a misdemeanor after the victim declined to cooperate. But what Tyler Reeves lacked in legitimate prospects, he made up for in ambition. He was tired of living paycheck to paycheck, tired of watching clients drive away in cars he couldn't afford, tired of being the help in rooms full of people with money. He wanted more. And when he spotted Brittany Patterson on the gym floor, he recognized something in her immediately. He recognized himself. Tyler approached her during her third session, correcting her form on a deadlift with hands that lingered a moment longer than strictly necessary. He asked if she wanted a complimentary training assessment. She accepted. By the end of that first session, Brittany had given him her phone number. Within a month, they were sleeping together. The affair Brittany conducted with Tyler was the inverse of her relationship with Raymond. With Raymond, she had been calculating and patient, building toward a goal with methodical precision. With Tyler, she was reckless and impulsive, driven by something that felt closer to desire than strategy. Tyler made her feel young in a way that Raymond, despite the age gap between them, never had. He was spontaneous, dangerous, unpredictable. He didn't ask about her day or her feelings. He pulled her into bathroom stalls at bars and left marks on her neck that she had to cover with scarves before going home to her husband. For the first time in her life, Brittany Collins was not in control, and she loved it. But Tyler Reeves was not driven by passion any more than Brittany had been driven by love when she pursued Raymond. He saw in Brittany an opportunity, a married woman with access to a wealthy husband, already unhappy, already looking for an exit. He understood, in ways she didn't fully appreciate, that her exit strategy and his advancement could become the same thing. What Tyler wanted was simple: money. He was 24, broke, and tired of working for wages that barely covered his rent. Brittany was his path to a different life. The only question was how to access Raymond's wealth without Raymond standing in the way. The conversations began casually that summer, half jokes about how much easier everything would be if Raymond simply wasn't around. "What if he just disappeared?" Tyler asked one night, lying in a hotel room they had rented by the hour. "Don't tempt me," Brittany replied, not entirely joking. Tyler pressed. Further. I'm serious. What would you get? Brittany considered the question with more seriousness than she should have. Everything. Life insurance, the house, all of it. These conversations, recovered months later from text messages and phone records, would become central evidence in the prosecution's case. But in the moment, they felt abstract, hypothetical, the kind of dark fantasies that unhappy people indulge without ever intending to act on them. Except Brittany Collins had spent her entire life acting on the things other people only fantasized about. In September 2016, she convinced Raymond to purchase a $2 million life insurance policy with her as the sole beneficiary. She presented it as a practical consideration, the kind of responsible financial planning that a man in his 50s with a younger wife should undertake. Raymond didn't question it. He had always been financially cautious, and life insurance seemed like basic prudence. He signed the paperwork without reading the fine print, without asking why his wife had suddenly become so interested in the details of his death. He didn't know that Brittany had already started researching methods of murder that would look like accidents. Throughout that fall and into the winter of 2016, Brittany conducted her research with the same methodical attention she had once applied to studying the Patterson family. Her browser history, recovered later by forensic analysts, showed hundreds of searches: brake failure symptoms, undetectable car sabotage, car accidents ruled as accidents, brake line cutting techniques. She wasn't impulsive about this. She wasn't desperate. She was gathering information, weighing options, calculating probabilities. Tyler's role emerged through their conversations. He wasn't a mechanic, but he knew enough about cars to be useful. He had worked briefly at an auto body shop after high school, and he had connections who could acquire tools without asking questions. His job would be simple: access Raymond's vehicle, sabotage the brakes in a way that wouldn't be immediately visible, and ensure the failure would occur at high speed on a road where help wouldn't arrive quickly. Brittany's job was to ensure Raymond would be driving alone on exactly that kind of road. Meanwhile, across town, Diane Patterson experienced something she would later describe as a premonition. She was in the produce section of a grocery store when she was suddenly overwhelmed by the urge to call Raymond. She hadn't spoken to him in over a year, had no reason to reach out, but the feeling was insistent, almost physical. Something was wrong. Something terrible was approaching. She didn't make the call. She told herself it was residual attachment, nothing more. But the feeling stayed with her for days. Because somewhere in her subconscious, Diane Patterson already knew what her conscious mind couldn't accept. The man who had betrayed her was in danger, and the danger was wearing his wedding ring. The plan to murder Raymond Patterson crystallized over 9 months, evolving from whispered fantasies in hotel rooms to detailed logistics documented in text messages that neither conspirator thought to delete carefully enough. Brittany Collins. Patterson and Tyler James Reeves approached homicide with the same energy other couples might apply to planning a vacation, dividing responsibilities, troubleshooting potential problems, setting timelines that accounted for variables they couldn't control. Between January and May of 2017, Brittany conducted what investigators would later describe as due diligence on murder. Her search history from this period read like a curriculum in vehicular homicide. How do car brakes work? Brake failure at high speed. Average response time for ambulances in rural areas. Accidents ruled mechanical failure. She researched famous cases where killers had sabotaged vehicles and gotten away with it. She researched cases where they had been caught. She studied the differences between them, looking for patterns that might inform her own approach. What emerged from her research was a preference for simplicity. Poison was too traceable. Hiring a professional was too risky. But mechanical failure, properly executed, could appear entirely accidental. Cars broke down all the time. Brakes failed. People died in crashes every day, and most of those deaths were never investigated beyond a cursory accident report. The key was choosing the right road. Brittany selected the stretch of Highway 99 between Medford and Ashland after months of consideration. Raymond drove this route regularly for business meetings with vineyard clients in southern Oregon. The road featured descending curves, elevation changes, and limited cell service. It was remote enough that emergency response would be delayed, but traveled enough that witnesses would eventually discover the wreckage. In June 2017, Brittany accompanied Raymond on one of his Medford trips, claiming she wanted to see the wine country she had heard so much about. What she actually wanted was reconnaissance. She noted the locations where guardrails were weakest, where the terrain dropped off most steeply, where an accident would be most likely to prove fatal. She photographed the route on her phone, creating a visual record of potential crash sites. She deleted those photographs afterward. Forensic analysts would recover them 4 months later. Tyler's preparation was more physical. He visited a salvage yard outside the city limits, purchasing junked cars for what he claimed was a restoration project. In reality, he was practicing. He needed to understand exactly how brake lines could be compromised without immediate detection, how to create a gradual failure that would manifest only under specific conditions. He learned that cutting the lines too deeply would cause immediate problems. Cutting them too shallowly might not cause problems at all. The perfect cut would allow brake fluid to leak slowly, producing a catastrophic failure only when the driver pumped the brakes repeatedly at high speed. The kind of pumping that would happen on a road full of curves. Throughout this period, Raymond remained oblivious. His marriage had settled into a tense routine, civil but distant, two people sharing space without sharing much else. He attributed Brittany's emotional withdrawal to the natural cooling that happens in any relationship once the honeymoon phase ends. He didn't notice her late-night text conversations. He didn't question her sudden interest in his work schedule. He didn't wonder why she had started asking detailed questions about his Southern Oregon client meetings. Raymond Patterson was so preoccupied with the failure of his second marriage that he failed to notice his wife was planning his murder. The original timeline called for the sabotage to occur in August 2017. Tyler had acquired everything he needed: brake line cutters, the appropriate wrenches, gloves that wouldn't leave fingerprints. But complications arose. Raymond's schedule changed unexpectedly when a business trip to Seattle meant his car sat in an airport parking lot for 2 weeks, too public for tampering. Then Tyler developed cold feet, disappearing for 3 weeks without explanation before Brittany tracked him down at his apartment. She reminded him what was at stake. "You're in this now," she told him, her voice cold and steady. "If I go down, you go down with me. There's no walking away from this." Tyler understood. He had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The only way out was through. By September, the plan was back on track. Raymond had a client meeting scheduled in Medford on October 14th, a Saturday when traffic would be lighter and witnesses fewer. Tyler would access the vehicle on the night of October 13th, while Raymond slept and Brittany ensured the garage door remained unlocked. In the weeks before the planned murder, Brittany became noticeably warmer toward her husband. She suggested they plan a trip to Italy in the spring. She cooked dinner, something she rarely bothered with anymore. She told Raymond she wanted to work on their marriage, that she knew things had been difficult, but she was committed to making it better. Raymond was confused but hopeful. Maybe the investment was finally paying off. Maybe Brittany was maturing into the partner he had hoped she would become. He went to sleep on the night of October 13th, 2017, feeling more optimistic about his marriage than he had in months. In the garage below, Tyler Reeves was cutting his brake lines. Thank you so much for your incredible support. This channel exists because of viewers like you. If you want to help us keep bringing you stories like this one, consider joining our YouTube membership for exclusive perks and premium content. Every member helps us continue creating the documentaries you love. But for now, let's return to what happened next. Because October 14th, 2017, was about to become the worst day of Raymond Patterson's life. And the last normal day the Holt family would ever know. The evening of October 13th, 2017, unfolded with the mundane rhythms of ordinary life. Raymond and Brittany ordered Thai food from the restaurant down the street, splitting pad Thai and green curry, while half-watching a nature documentary neither of them was particularly interested in. Brittany poured wine, refilling Raymond's glass with an attentiveness she hadn't shown in months, asking about his meeting the next day with an interest that felt almost genuine. "What time do you think you'll be back?" she asked, setting the wine bottle on the coffee table between them. Raymond calculated distances and meeting lengths in his head. Should be home by 7. Maybe 8 if the meeting runs long. The vineyard owner wants to expand his contract, so it might take some time to work through the details. Brittany nodded, storing this information alongside everything else she had gathered. Drive safe tomorrow, she said, the irony of her words lost on no one but Raymond himself. Later that night, after Raymond had fallen asleep, Brittany slipped out of bed and walked to the garage door that connected to the kitchen. She unlocked it, leaving it slightly ajar, then returned to the bedroom and sent a single text to Tyler. Garage door unlocked. Be quiet. His response came 30 seconds later. On my way. Security camera footage from a neighbor's home captured what happened next. At 2:47 a.m., a figure appeared on the sidewalk, dressed in dark clothing with a hood obscuring his face. The figure walked with purpose, but without haste, the gait of someone who had rehearsed this moment many times in his mind. He turned into the Patterson driveway and disappeared from view. Tyler Reeves spent 43 minutes in the Patterson garage. He had practiced this procedure dozens of times on junked cars at the salvage yard, refining his technique until he could perform it in near-total darkness. He located the brake lines beneath Raymond's BMW, positioned his tools, and made the cuts he had calculated to the millimeter. Not deep enough to cause immediate failure. Not shallow enough to go unnoticed during a standard inspection. Just deep enough to ensure that brake fluid would leak slowly, invisibly, until the moment Raymond needed his brakes most. By 3:30 a.m., Tyler was gone. He walked back the way he had come, his tools in a backpack he would dispose of later that morning. The neighbor's camera captured his departure the same way it had captured his arrival. A dark figure moving through the night, anonymous and unhurried. The trap was set. Raymond woke at 6:15 a.m., earlier than usual, his body anticipating the long drive ahead. He showered, dressed in his good suit, the charcoal one Brittany had purchased for him during their trip to London, and ate a quick breakfast of toast and coffee. Brittany was still in bed when he left, or at least appeared to be. Drive safe, she murmured from beneath the covers, not opening her eyes. I'll see you tonight. Always do, he replied, bending to kiss her forehead before heading to the garage. He didn't notice that the garage door to the kitchen was unlocked when it should have been secured. He didn't notice the slight dampness beneath his car where brake fluid had already begun its slow leak. He climbed into his BMW, started the engine, and pulled out into the gray October morning, his mind already focused on the business meeting ahead. The drive from Portland to Medford took approximately 4.5 hours, depending on traffic and stops. Raymond settled into the familiar rhythm of long-distance driving, stopping for coffee at a drive-thru in Salem, listening to an audiobook about business management strategies that a colleague had recommended. The morning was overcast but dry, the kind of Pacific Northwest weather that locals consider ideal for travel. He had driven this route dozens of times over the years, could have navigated it blindfolded, felt no premonition of what was waiting for him at the other end. His meeting with the vineyard owner ran from 10 a.m. until past 2:30 p.m., longer than expected but productive. Raymond secured a contract extension worth $180,000 annually, a significant win that would help stabilize his business finances after the damage Brittany's spending had inflicted. He texted his wife with the good news. Got the contract, celebrating tonight. Her response arrived within minutes. That's amazing. Can't wait to celebrate. Drive safe. The heart emoji at the end of her message felt almost mocking in retrospect. What Brittany actually texted, moments after responding to her husband, went to Tyler. He's leaving Medford now. Should happen within the next hour. Raymond departed Medford at 3:15 p.m., expecting to arrive home around 7 p.m. The weather had deteriorated during his meeting, light rain now falling steadily, reducing visibility and making the road surfaces slick. He turned on his windshield wipers, adjusted his speed slightly downward, and merged onto Highway 99 for the stretch through the Siskiyou Pass. What Raymond Patterson didn't know, as he approached the curves that Brittany had so carefully scouted 6 months earlier, was that his brakes were operating on borrowed time. Each pump of the pedal was releasing more fluid through the cuts Tyler had made. Each mile was bringing him closer to the moment when pressing the brake would accomplish nothing at all. Gerald and Patricia Holt were also on Highway 99 that afternoon. They had been married for 43 years. Gerald was a retired high school principal from Ashland. Patricia was a retired nurse who had spent her career caring for others. They had driven to Medford that morning to visit their grandchildren, spending the afternoon playing board games and watching cartoons before the long drive home. They left Medford at 3:45 p.m., 30 minutes after Raymond. They were traveling north on Highway 99 while he traveled south. Their paths would intersect at 4:47 p.m. at a curve known locally as the Serpent. Gerald and Patricia Holt had no idea that a stranger's choices were about to end their story forever. And as Raymond's BMW approached the Serpent, brake fluid continuing its silent leak, the collision that would change everything was now less than 30 minutes away. The stretch of Highway 99 where Raymond Patterson's life would change forever descended through the Siskiyou foothills in a series of curves that had earned their local nickname Honestly. The Serpent wound through terrain that offered no forgiveness for mistakes, with guardrails that safety engineers had flagged in multiple reports as inadequate for the speed limits posted on the road. On a clear day, the views were spectacular. On a rainy October afternoon, with visibility reduced and road surfaces slick, the curves demanded a driver's full attention. Raymond was traveling at 62 miles per hour when he approached the first warning sign that something was wrong. He was navigating a moderate curve, nothing unusual, when he pressed his brake pedal and felt it respond differently than expected. The pedal felt soft, spongy, lacking the firm resistance he had grown accustomed to over years of driving this vehicle. He pressed harder, and the car slowed, but not as quickly as it should have. Raymond frowned, made a mental note to have the brakes inspected when he returned to Portland, and continued down the mountain. He had less than 4 minutes to live the life he had known. The second sign came 90 seconds later, another curve slightly sharper than the first. Raymond pressed his brake pedal and felt it sink further toward the floor than it ever had before. The car's speed dropped, but barely, the deceleration nowhere close to what the curve demanded. Raymond's frown deepened into concern. He pumped the pedal rapidly, trying to rebuild pressure, a technique his father had taught him decades ago for emergencies. The technique assumed there was fluid in the lines to pressurize. There wasn't. Not anymore. The final curve, the sharpest in the Serpent sequence, appeared around a blind corner. A 45-degree turn with a guardrail that had been cited in 3 separate safety audits as insufficient for the forces a vehicle at speed might generate. Raymond pressed his brake pedal all the way to the floor and felt nothing. No resistance, no response, no deceleration whatsoever. His speedometer held steady at 60 miles per hour. The curve was 50 feet away. Raymond's hands tightened on the steering wheel as his brain processed what was happening. No brakes. 60 miles per hour. A curve he couldn't navigate at this speed. Options cycled through his mind in the fraction of a second remaining. Downshift to slow the engine, pull the emergency brake, steer into the guardrail deliberately. But fractions of seconds are not enough time to execute complex decisions. Fractions of seconds are only enough time to understand that you are about to die. The curve was 30 feet away. Raymond's BMW crossed the center line as the physics of the situation took control. The tires fought for traction on the rain-slicked road, found none, and the vehicle began a trajectory that no amount of steering could correct. The Honda Accord carrying Gerald and Patricia Holt was traveling north at 45 miles per hour, well under the speed limit as Gerald navigated the curves with the caution of a man who had lived in these mountains his entire life. He saw the BMW cross the center line and had perhaps 1 second to react. 1 second to understand that a stranger's vehicle was careening directly toward them. 1 second to turn the wheel, press his own brakes, do something, anything. 1 second was not enough. The collision occurred at 4:47 p.m., driver's side to driver's side, at a combined speed of approximately 107 miles per hour. The sound was catastrophic, metal crushing, glass shattering, the primal shriek of materials failing in ways they were never designed to fail. The Honda Accord absorbed the impact first, its older safety systems overwhelmed by forces that exceeded their design specifications by an order of magnitude. The BMW spun after impact, its momentum carrying it sideways into the guardrail, which buckled but did not break, wrapping the vehicle around its posts like aluminum foil around a kitchen implement. Gerald Holt died instantly, the steering column compressed into his chest before his brain could register pain, before his hand could complete its reach toward his wife's arm. He was gone between one heartbeat and the next, his 43 years of marriage ending in a fraction of a second on a road he had driven hundreds of times before. Patricia Holt survived the initial impact for approximately 40 seconds. The passenger side of the Honda had crumpled less severely than the driver's side, giving her body enough space to remain intact even as the vehicle disintegrated around her. She was conscious for those 40 seconds. She could see her husband's motionless form beside her. She reached out, her fingers finding his hand where it had landed after the collision, and held it as her own internal injuries overwhelmed her body's ability to function. The first responders, who arrived 18 minutes later, found Patricia Holt's hand still clasped in her husband's. They had to separate them to extract her body from the wreckage. Raymond Patterson was wearing his seatbelt when the collision occurred. The airbags deployed as designed. These factors saved his life, though what remained of his life would barely resemble the one he had known. His left leg was pinned beneath the crumpled dashboard, the femur shattered in 3 places, the tissue destroyed beyond any hope of reconstruction. His left hand had been caught between the door frame and the steering column at the moment of impact, severing it cleanly at the wrist, but he was breathing. A passing motorist called 911 at 4:49 p.m. The volunteer fire crew from a station 3 miles away arrived at 5:07 p.m. to a scene that several of them would describe in later interviews as the worst they had ever witnessed. The Honda Accord was essentially unrecognizable as a vehicle, the front half compressed to roughly a third of its original size. The BMW was wrapped around the guardrail at an angle that defied geometry, fluids pooling beneath it, smoke rising from somewhere in the engine compartment, and from the driver's seat of the BMW came a sound that one firefighter would later describe as something I'll never unhear. Raymond Patterson was screaming. Not words, just sound. The primal expression of a body experiencing trauma it cannot process. A mind confronting damage it cannot comprehend. The extraction took 43 minutes. Paramedics administered emergency care while firefighters cut through the metal that had become Raymond's cage. Tourniquets for the severed wrist. Stabilization for the shattered leg. Fluids for the blood loss that had already pushed him toward shock. By the time they loaded him into the helicopter that would transport him to Providence Medford Medical Center, Raymond had lost consciousness. The attending physician who received him gave him a 30% chance of surviving the night. In Portland, Brittany Patterson's phone rang at 5:23 p.m. An Oregon State Police dispatcher informed her that her husband had been involved in a serious accident, that he was being airlifted to a hospital in Medford, that his condition was critical. She hung up the phone and sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the wall, processing the information she had received. Then she called Tyler. "He's alive," she said. 2 words that changed everything. Because Brittany Collins had planned for every contingency except one, the possibility that Raymond Patterson might survive. Brittany Patterson arrived at Providence Medford Medical Center shortly before midnight, nearly 7 hours after receiving the call that should have sent her racing south immediately. The drive from Portland to Medford typically took 4 hours under normal conditions. Brittany had taken significantly longer, stopping twice along the way, once to speak with Tyler by phone in a rest stop parking lot, and once simply to sit in her car at a gas station, engine running, thinking through her options. She had expected to receive a call notifying her of her husband's death. Instead, she had received news of his survival, and survival complicated everything. The life insurance policy required death to pay out. The inheritance required death to transfer. The future she had planned required Raymond Patterson to no longer be breathing, and yet here he was, clinging to life in an ICU bed 200 miles from home. When Brittany finally entered the hospital, she performed the role she had prepared for with the same skill she had applied to every other role in her life. She rushed to the nursing station with tears streaming down her face. She held Raymond's unconscious hand at his bedside. She asked question after question about his prognosis, his treatment, his chances. The nursing staff documented her distress as genuine, describing her in their notes as inconsolable and deeply affected. One nurse offered to bring her coffee. Another found her a more comfortable chair for the bedside vigil. None of them suspected they were watching a woman whose primary concern was not whether her husband would survive, but what his survival would mean for her plans. Raymond's condition stabilized over the following hours, though his body would never recover from the damage it had sustained. Surgeons amputated his left leg below the knee on October 15th, the tissue too destroyed by the impact for any possibility of reconstruction. His severed hand was reattached in a marathon surgery that lasted 11 hours, but subsequent infections would require a second amputation at the wrist 3 weeks later. By October 16th, 2 days after the crash, the medical team had reached a consensus. Raymond Patterson would survive. He would be permanently disabled, confined to a wheelchair, dependent on prosthetics for the rest of his life. But he would live. For Brittany, this was the worst possible outcome. Hospital staff noticed the change in her demeanor within hours of learning Raymond would survive. The tearful devotion that had characterized her first day evaporated, replaced by something colder, more distant. She stopped touching Raymond's hand. She sat in the corner of his room, scrolling through her phone, barely acknowledging the nurses who came to check on her husband's condition. When doctors entered to discuss rehabilitation options and long-term care requirements, she excused herself to take phone calls that seemed to have no urgency. One nurse documented her observations in the patient file. Wife appears emotionally withdrawn. Minimal engagement with patient care discussions. Possible delayed shock response. It wasn't delayed shock. It was a woman who had realized her plan had failed and was already calculating her exit. On the morning of October 16th, Raymond Patterson briefly regained consciousness for the first time since the accident. He was disoriented, in tremendous pain, and terrified by the unfamiliar surroundings and the horrifying absence where his left leg should have been. His eyes searched the room frantically until they landed on Brittany, sitting in the corner, her attention focused on her phone. "Brittany," he whispered, his voice raw from the breathing tube that had been removed hours earlier. "You're here." She looked up. Her expression was unreadable, a mask that revealed nothing of what she was thinking. "I'm here," she confirmed, but she didn't move toward his bed. She didn't take his hand. She didn't offer comfort. Raymond's eyes closed again, exhaustion pulling him back under. He assumed his wife was simply in shock, processing the trauma of nearly losing him. He had no idea she was processing something else entirely. The realization that the man she had married for his money was now a liability rather than an asset. That evening, while Raymond slept, Brittany Collins Patterson checked out of her hotel room near the hospital. She left no message for the nursing staff. She didn't tell Raymond she was leaving. She simply packed her suitcase, climbed into her car, and drove north toward Portland, leaving her husband alone in a hospital bed before the anesthesia from his surgeries had fully cleared his system. When Raymond woke the next morning, still groggy, still confused, he asked for his wife immediately. The nursing staff exchanged uncomfortable glances. They tried calling Brittany's phone repeatedly, receiving only voicemail. They tried the home number Raymond provided, hearing only an answering machine. It took Raymond 2 days to fully understand what had happened. 2 days of asking for his wife, of being told she hadn't returned, of watching the door to his room and seeing only nurses and doctors, and eventually, police officers with questions about the accident. His wife had abandoned him. The woman he had destroyed his marriage for, alienated his children for, spent his savings for, had walked out before he was even fully conscious, leaving him alone in a hospital where he knew no one, facing a future he couldn't comprehend. The nursing staff described his emotional collapse as devastating. He refused food for 2 days. He wept for hours at a time. He asked the same question repeatedly, a question none of them could answer. Why did she leave? He wouldn't learn the truth about that question for another 3 months. But the truth was already beginning to surface, rising from the wreckage on Highway 99 like smoke from smoldering metal. Because Detective Sandra Whitman of the Oregon State Police Major Crimes Division had started asking questions about the crash, and the answer she was finding pointed in a direction no one had expected. Megan Patterson learned about her father's accident the way most people learn about tragedies in the modern age, from a television screen. She was in her apartment in Portland, half watching a local news broadcast while preparing for an early nursing shift the following morning, when a reporter's words pulled her full attention to the screen. A fatal crash on Highway 99 in southern Oregon. A retired couple killed. A third victim in critical condition. And then her father's name scrolling across the bottom of the screen in the impersonal typography of breaking news. Her phone was in her hand before she consciously decided to make a call. Her mother answered on the second ring. The conversation that followed was brief and painful. Two women processing shock in real time while trying to determine what, if anything, they were supposed to do about the man who had hurt them both so deeply. "Where's Brittany?" Diane asked, her voice tight with an emotion Megan couldn't quite identify. "I don't know," Megan admitted. "I haven't talked to her in years. She should be there with him." But Brittany wasn't there, as they would both discover in the coming days. Brittany was gone. Vanished from Raymond's life as completely as she had once vanished from Megan's. Diane Patterson spent the night after learning about Raymond's accident unable to sleep, cycling through emotions she hadn't expected to feel. She was angry at herself for caring what happened to a man who had betrayed her so thoroughly. She was confused by the grief that kept surfacing despite everything. She was torn between the woman she wanted to be, someone strong enough to walk away from a person who didn't deserve her compassion, and the woman she actually was, someone who couldn't ignore suffering, even when it visited a person who had caused her so much pain. By morning, she had made her decision. She drove to Medford alone, not telling Megan or Derek where she was going, because she knew they would try to talk her out of it. The 4-hour drive passed in a blur of rural Oregon scenery and internal argument, Diane questioning her choice every mile while simultaneously pressing the accelerator toward her destination. She arrived at Providence Medford Medical Center at 11:00 a.m. on October 19th, 5 days after the crash, 3 days after Brittany's abandonment. She found Raymond's room by following the directions of a helpful receptionist who assumed she was family. When she pushed open the door, she found a man she barely recognized. Raymond had lost significant weight in the 5 days since the accident, his face gaunt, his eyes hollow, his body diminished in ways that went beyond the missing limb. He was unwashed, unkempt, with no visitors logged since Brittany had departed. He looked like a man who had given up. Diane sat down in the chair beside his bed. The movement caught Raymond's attention, and he turned his head slowly, as if the effort of moving required more energy than he possessed. His eyes focused on his ex-wife's face, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. "Diane?" His voice was barely a whisper, raw from crying and weakened by days of refusing food. "What are you doing here?" She took a breath before answering, choosing her words carefully because she knew they would define whatever relationship they would have going forward. Someone had to be. Raymond's eyes filled with tears. This time, the crying was different from the breakdown the nurses had witnessed, quieter and somehow more devastating. These were the tears of a man confronting the consequences of his choices, seeing them reflected in the face of the woman he had discarded for someone younger and more exciting. "I'm sorry," he said, the words inadequate for the weight they needed to carry. "I'm so sorry, Diane, for everything, for all of it." Diane didn't respond to his apology immediately. She wasn't ready to offer absolution, wasn't sure she ever would be. Instead, she explained why she had come, setting boundaries that would define her involvement in his recovery. "I'm not here to reconcile," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion pressing against her words. "We're not getting back together. Too much has happened for that. But you're the father of my children, and they can't watch you die alone in a hospital. So I'm going to help you through this, Ray. I'm going to make sure you get the care you need and the rehabilitation you deserve, because that's what decent people do for each other, even when it's hard." She didn't mention Brittany. She didn't ask where Raymond's new wife had gone or why she had left. Those questions could wait. What mattered now was ensuring that the father of her children survived long enough to maybe, someday, rebuild some fragment of the relationships he had destroyed. Over the following weeks, Diane became the organizing force behind Raymond's recovery. She coordinated with doctors about treatment plans and surgery schedules. She researched rehabilitation facilities and selected one in Portland that specialized in patients with multiple limb loss. She hired physical therapists, occupational therapists, and mental health counselors, assembling a team that would support Raymond through the long process of learning to live in his diminished body. She did all of this without complaint, without seeking recognition, without expecting anything in return. When Raymond's business associates expressed confusion about her involvement, she offered no explanation. When neighbors asked why she was helping the man who had betrayed her, she simply said it was the right thing to do. When Megan struggled to understand how her mother could show such grace, Diane replied with the same words she had given Raymond. "That's what decent people do." Megan visited her father for the first time in mid-November. The encounter was awkward and brief. 15 minutes of stilted conversation in a rehabilitation facility room that smelled of antiseptic and mechanical lubricant. But it was a start. She came back a week later, and the week after that. The conversations grew slightly easier, though they remained carefully restricted to safe topics. Weather, sports, her nursing shifts. The important things, the painful things, stayed buried beneath the surface, too heavy to carry yet. Derek followed his sister's lead, showing up at his father's door one afternoon without warning. He stood in the threshold for a full minute, unable to enter, unable to leave. Raymond looked at his son with eyes that held equal measures of hope and shame. "I don't know how to do this," Derek admitted. "Neither do I," Raymond replied. It was the most honest thing Raymond Patterson had ever said. And somewhere in that honesty, in that mutual acknowledgement of brokenness, the first fragile threads of reconnection began to form. Detective Sandra Whitman had spent 22 years with the Oregon State Police, the last 12 of them in the Major Crimes Division, where she had built a reputation for noticing details that other investigators overlooked. The Highway 99 crash landed on her desk because the initial accident report raised questions that the responding officers couldn't answer. A vehicle that had passed inspection 6 months earlier, maintained by an owner with no history of mechanical negligence, had experienced a brake failure so complete that it defied standard explanations. Whitman requested the forensic analysis 3 days after the crash, before Raymond Patterson had even regained consciousness, before Brittany had abandoned her husband, before anyone suspected the accident was anything other than a tragic mechanical failure. She requested it because something about the report felt wrong, the kind of intuition that had served her well over 2 decades of investigating crimes that appeared, on the surface, to be accidents. The forensic report arrived on November 15th, and what it contained confirmed Whitman's suspicions. The brake lines on Raymond Patterson's BMW had been deliberately compromised. The cuts were precise, made with tools designed for exactly this purpose, positioned to create a gradual fluid loss rather than immediate failure. Someone with mechanical knowledge had designed the failure to occur at high speed, on a specific type of road, under specific driving conditions. This was not an accident. This was attempted murder. And in the case of Gerald and Patricia Holt, whose Honda Accord had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, it was successful murder times 2. Whitman began her investigation with the fundamental question that drives all homicide cases: who benefits? She pulled Raymond Patterson's financial records, his insurance policies, his estate documents. What she found painted a clear picture. Brittany Collins Patterson held a $2 million life insurance policy on her husband, taken out in September 2016, just 13 months before the crash. She was listed as the sole beneficiary of his will. She had been added to the deed of their home 6 months after their wedding. More significantly, she had abandoned her husband in the hospital within 48 hours of his survival, disappearing from Medford without explanation, without goodbye, without any of the behaviors expected from a devoted wife whose husband had nearly died. The insurance company's fraud detection algorithm had already flagged Brittany's claim as high risk based on timing alone. But they hadn't connected her to the sabotage. They hadn't begun looking at the crash as a crime rather than a misfortune. That connection was Whitman's to make. In late November, Whitman obtained authorization to place Brittany Collins Patterson under surveillance. The reports that came back from the surveillance team painted a picture of a woman showing no signs of grief. Shopping trips to boutiques in the Pearl District. Daily visits to an upscale gym in downtown Portland. Dinners with friends at restaurants where the entrees cost more than some people's hourly wages. If Brittany was mourning her husband's near-death experience, she was hiding it extraordinarily well. More significantly, the surveillance team observed Brittany meeting repeatedly with a man who was clearly not her husband. The meetings took place at hotels, at the man's apartment, at locations designed for privacy rather than public interaction. Whitman ran the man's license plate and pulled his identification. Tyler James Reeves, 25 years old, employed as a personal trainer at the same gym Brittany frequented. Tyler's background check made Whitman's pulse quicken. Theft charges dating back to his late teens. An assault conviction that had been pleaded down to a misdemeanor. And most significantly, employment history that included a stint at an auto body shop, where he would have learned exactly the skills needed to sabotage a vehicle's braking system. Whitman requested Tyler's phone records. What she found broke the case open. Tyler Reeves had not been careful about deleting evidence. His phone contained months of text conversations with Brittany Patterson, conversations that escalated from flirtatious banter to explicit exchanges to discussions that could only be described as conspiracy to commit murder. Messages about timing, about locations, about what Brittany would inherit when Raymond was gone. Messages about brake lines and rural highways and emergency response times. One exchange, dated October 12th, 2 days before the crash, left no room for interpretation. Tyler: tomorrow night. You sure he'll be driving the usual route? Brittany: positive. Has a meeting in Medford Saturday. Always takes 99 home. Tyler: and you'll be where? Brittany: Portland, with witnesses. I'll get the call when it's done. Whitman had her evidence. She had motive, means, and opportunity. She had text messages that read like a confession. She had 2 dead victims, 1 surviving victim, and 2 suspects who believed they had gotten away with murder. On February 3, 2018, Detective Sandra Whitman arrested Brittany Collins Patterson at her Portland home. Officers took her into custody without incident, reading her rights while she stood in the doorway of the house Raymond had bought for her, wearing pajamas that cost more than most people's car payments. Tyler James Reeves was arrested the same morning at his apartment, his reaction far less composed. He demanded to know what was happening, insisted on calling a lawyer, proclaimed his innocence in increasingly desperate tones. Brittany, by contrast, remained collected throughout her arrest. She asked only one question as officers handcuffed her. Is there any way to keep this quiet? There wasn't. The story of what really happened on Highway 99 was about to become public. And Raymond Patterson was about to learn the truth about the woman he had destroyed his family to be with. The interrogation of Brittany Collins. Patterson lasted 11 hours spread across 2 days, conducted in a windowless room at the Marion County Sheriff's Office by Detective Whitman and a department psychologist who specialized in interviewing suspects with antisocial personality indicators. Brittany arrived in the same composed demeanor that had characterized her arrest, dressed in county-issued clothing that seemed somehow inadequate for a woman who had spent years cultivating an image of luxury and sophistication. For the first 6 hours, she denied everything. Her lawyer, a criminal defense specialist from Portland named Robert Kane, had advised her to maintain her innocence, to challenge the evidence, to create reasonable doubt wherever possible. Brittany followed this advice with the same methodical precision she had applied to planning Raymond's murder. She claimed the text messages had been fabricated, that someone had hacked Tyler's phone, that she was the victim of a vindictive ex-wife who had orchestrated an elaborate frame job. Detective Whitman listened to these denials without interruption, letting Brittany talk herself into corners, building a record of lies that would contradict the physical evidence she hadn't yet presented. When Brittany finally ran out of explanations, Whitman produced her breakthrough evidence: security camera footage from the neighbor's house showing Tyler Reeves entering the Patterson garage on the night of October 13th. Brittany watched the footage in silence. The timestamp was clearly visible in the corner of the frame. The figure's movements matched Tyler's distinctive gait. The jacket he wore matched clothing recovered from his apartment during the arrest. When the footage ended, Brittany looked at Detective Whitman with an expression that had finally lost its composure. "I want a lawyer present for any further questions," she said. The negotiations that followed lasted 3 days. Brittany's attorney pushed for reduced charges, for consideration of mitigating circumstances, for any concession that might spare his client the maximum penalties Oregon law allowed. The prosecution pushed back, representing not only the state, but the Holt family, who had lost 2 beloved parents to Brittany's greed. The deal they reached was straightforward. Brittany would provide a full confession in exchange for the prosecution's agreement to take the death penalty off the table. Oregon had not executed anyone since 1997, but the threat remained on the books, and prosecutors were willing to use it as leverage. On February 8th, Brittany Collins Patterson sat in an interrogation room and confessed to conspiracy to commit murder. Her confession was comprehensive and chilling. She detailed the timeline of her affair with Tyler, beginning in spring 2016 and escalating through that summer and fall. She explained how the idea of killing Raymond had evolved from dark fantasy to concrete planning, how she had researched methods of undetectable murder, how she had selected Highway 99 based on its curves and isolation and poor emergency response times. She described persuading Raymond to purchase life insurance, ensuring the garage door was unlocked for Tyler's entry, texting her husband to drive safe hours before his brake lines were designed to fail. What struck investigators most was her complete lack of remorse. She spoke without guilt, without defensiveness, without any of the emotional markers typically present when people describe actions they regret. She discussed planning her husband's murder with the same detachment she might use to describe planning a dinner party. Detective Whitman pressed her on specific details. "Why did you want your husband dead?" Brittany's answer was delivered without hesitation. "Because he was more useful dead than alive. The insurance money, the property, the assets. I would have been set for life, and I wouldn't have had to pretend anymore." Pretend? To love him, to want him. He was old and boring. He thought buying me trips would make up for everything else. It didn't. Whitman asked about Gerald and Patricia Holt, the retired couple who had died in the collision. Brittany's response revealed the hollow core of her character. "I didn't know them." "That's not what I asked." A pause. "They weren't supposed to be there. That wasn't part of the plan." No apology. No expression of guilt. No acknowledgement that her actions had ended 2 innocent lives. Just a statement of fact, delivered with the same flat affect as everything else she had said. Tyler Reeves confessed the same day, offering a version of events that painted Brittany as the mastermind and himself as a reluctant participant drawn in by her manipulation and threats. He claimed she had pressured him, that she had threatened to implicate him in other crimes if he refused to help, that he had been afraid of her. Brittany's confession contradicted his. She described Tyler as eager from the start, as someone who saw opportunity in her unhappy marriage and pursued it with enthusiasm equal to her own. Neither version inspired sympathy. Both versions described cold-blooded planning that had resulted in 2 deaths and 1 survivor whose life had been permanently destroyed. Detective Whitman visited Raymond Patterson at his rehabilitation facility on February 10th to deliver the news. She told him everything: the affair between Brittany and Tyler, the insurance policy taken out months before the crash, the text messages planning his murder, the sabotage of his brake lines. Raymond listened in silence, his face cycling through emotions that Detective Whitman had witnessed in countless victims before. Shock, disbelief, anger, grief. When she finished, he asked only one question. "Did she ever love me? Even a little?" Whitman didn't have an answer. Some questions don't have answers, not the kind that provide any comfort. What she could tell him was that the woman who had tried to kill him would spend the rest of her life in prison. What she couldn't tell him was how to live with the knowledge that everything he had sacrificed, everything he had thrown away, had been for someone who saw him only as a means to an end. The trial of Brittany Collins Patterson and Tyler James Reeves began on June 4, 2018, in a courtroom packed with journalists, spectators, and family members of the victims who had waited 8 months for this moment of accountability. Judge Helen Marcos presided, a veteran jurist known for running efficient proceedings and tolerating no theatrics from either prosecution or defense. The case had attracted significant media attention, the story of a young woman who had seduced her best friend's father and then conspired to murder him, proving irresistible to true crime enthusiasts and casual observers alike. The charges against both defendants were extensive. 2 counts of first-degree murder for Gerald and Patricia Holt, 1 count of attempted murder for Raymond Patterson, 1 count of conspiracy to commit murder, and 1 count of insurance fraud. If convicted on all counts, both faced the possibility of life in prison without parole. The death penalty, while technically available under Oregon law, had been taken off the table in exchange for Brittany's confession. Assistant District Attorney Thomas Rivera led the prosecution. A 15-year veteran of the Marion County District Attorney's Office, Rivera had built a reputation for meticulous case preparation and devastating cross-examinations. His opening statement laid out the evidence in chronological order, building a narrative that began with Brittany's calculated seduction of Raymond Patterson and ended with the carnage on Highway 99. "This case is about greed," Rivera told the jury. "It's about a woman who saw another person's life and decided she deserved it. It's about a man who helped her try to take it. And it's about 2 innocent people, Gerald and Patricia Holt, who paid the ultimate price for these defendants' ambition." Brittany's defense attorney, Robert Kane, attempted a different narrative in his opening statement. He portrayed his client as a victim of circumstance, a young woman from poverty who had been taken advantage of by an older man and manipulated by a younger one. He suggested that Tyler had been the driving force behind the murder plot, that Brittany had been pressured into compliance, that her confession had been coerced during lengthy interrogation sessions. The jury didn't believe it. Over 14 weeks of testimony, Rivera systematically dismantled every argument the defense raised. He presented the forensic evidence, photographs of the severed brake lines, expert testimony explaining how the cuts had been designed to cause gradual failure, analysis proving the tools used matched those found in Tyler's possession. He presented the digital evidence, the text messages between Brittany and Tyler, the browser history showing months of research into vehicular homicide, the deleted photographs of Highway 99 that forensic analysts had recovered from Brittany's phone. But his most powerful evidence was Brittany herself. Rivera played her confession for the jury 3 times during the trial, at different points in the proceedings. Each time, the jury watched as Brittany described her murder plot in the flat, uninflected voice of someone discussing household errands rather than the planned killing of another human being. Each time, the jurors' expressions hardened. Each time, the gap between Brittany's words and normal human emotion became more apparent. The Holt family attended every day of the trial. Susan, Michael, and James Holt sat in the front row behind the prosecution, their presence a constant reminder that the crimes being discussed had victims beyond Raymond Patterson. Their parents had been married 43 years. Their parents had been holding hands when they died. Susan Holt was permitted to make a statement during the penalty phase of the trial, addressing Brittany directly, while the defendant sat expressionless at the defense table. "My parents survived everything life threw at them," Susan said, her voice steady, despite the tears running down her face. "They were planning a cruise for their 45th anniversary, and you killed them because they happened to be on the same road as the man you wanted dead." She paused, composing herself before continuing. "My mother reached for my father's hand in the last seconds of her life. Did you know that? The first responders found her hand in his. You took that from them. You took everything from them. And for what? Money? A lifestyle?" Susan leaned forward, her eyes locked on Brittany's face. "I hope you spend the rest of your life hearing my mother's name. Patricia Holt. Say it. Remember it. Because I will never forget what you did to her." Brittany's expression didn't change during Susan's statement. She watched the grieving daughter with the same empty gaze she had shown throughout the trial, offering no reaction, no acknowledgement of the devastation she had caused. The prosecution also noted, during closing arguments, that despite being married to Raymond Patterson for nearly 2 years, Brittany had never given birth to any children from their union. There would be no legacy from this marriage, no innocent lives to consider, no complications in the sentencing. Just a calculating woman who had viewed her husband as nothing more than an insurance policy with a pulse. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts for both defendants. The foreman read each verdict while the Holt family held hands, while Raymond Patterson sat in his wheelchair with Diane beside him, while Brittany and Tyler stood motionless at the defense table. Judge Marcos delivered the sentences 2 weeks later. Brittany Collins Patterson received 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole for the murders of Gerald and Patricia Holt, plus an additional 30 years for the attempted murder of Raymond Patterson and the conspiracy conviction. Tyler James Reeves received identical sentences. Neither defendant displayed any visible reaction when the sentences were announced. They were led from the courtroom in separate groups, headed to separate facilities where they would spend the remainder of their lives. Raymond Patterson attended the verdict reading and the sentencing, wheeled into the courtroom by Diane, his children seated in the row behind him. When the guilty verdicts were announced, he didn't celebrate. He simply closed his eyes and bowed his head, acknowledging a moment he had waited months to witness. A journalist approached him outside the courthouse afterward, asking how he felt. "I don't feel anything," Raymond said. "I'm not sure I can anymore." It was an honest answer, and it captured something essential about what Brittany's crimes had taken from him beyond his leg and his hand. She had taken his capacity to feel, to trust, to believe that the world made any kind of sense. Some damage can't be repaired, no matter how many guilty verdicts get read. The guilty verdicts didn't bring Raymond Patterson peace. He had expected them to, had imagined that watching Brittany led away in handcuffs would provide some form of closure, some release from the weight he had carried since learning the truth about his crash. Instead, he felt hollow. The trial ended. The cameras moved on. And Raymond was left with the same broken body and broken spirit he had been living with for the past year, only now without even the distraction of court proceedings to occupy his thoughts. His rehabilitation continued through the fall and winter of 2018. He learned to use his prosthetics with grudging determination, spending hours each day in physical therapy sessions that left him exhausted and frustrated. He attended counseling sessions that his doctors insisted were mandatory, sitting across from therapists who asked him to talk about his feelings when he could barely identify what feelings he had left. He took the medications they prescribed, followed the exercise regimens they designed, did everything he was supposed to do to maximize his recovery. But something essential had gone out of him, and no amount of therapy or medication could bring it back. Diane continued to care for him, though she had returned to her own home after his rehabilitation was stable enough to allow independent living. She visited twice a week, ensuring he had groceries, that his medical appointments were kept, that human contact interrupted the long silences that had become his constant companion. She did this despite everything, despite the years of betrayal, despite the humiliation he had subjected her to. When Raymond asked her why, she gave him an answer that made him feel smaller than any of his physical limitations. "Because I refuse to become someone I'm not proud of," she said. "You made choices that damaged us. I get to make choices too, and I choose to be decent, even when it's hard." His relationship with his children rebuilt itself in small, tentative steps during these months. Megan came for Sunday dinners, cooking in his kitchen while they talked about her nursing shifts, her patients, the small moments of her daily life. Derek called weekly, their conversations awkward but consistent, covering sports and weather, and carefully avoiding the massive subjects that loomed between them. They didn't talk about Brittany. They didn't talk about the accident. They didn't talk about the years of estrangement or the choices that had caused it. But they showed up. Week after week, month after month, they showed up. And for Raymond, whose capacity to expect anything from anyone had been thoroughly destroyed, that showing up meant everything. In January 2019, Raymond contacted his attorney to update his estate documents. Every paper that had named Brittany as beneficiary was revised. The life insurance policies, now significantly reduced given his ongoing medical expenses, were redirected to Diane. The house he had purchased for Brittany was sold, the proceeds distributed according to his new instructions. His will was rewritten to protect his children and provide for the woman who had stood by him despite his worst failures. Brittany Collins Patterson, serving her sentence at Coffee Creek Correctional Facility in Wilsonville, would inherit nothing. She had never given him children, never contributed anything lasting to his life beyond destruction and betrayal. There would be no legacy from their marriage, no complication in his estate planning, just a clean severance of every legal tie that had ever connected them. The years that followed moved slowly for Raymond. The physical injuries from the crash had healed as much as they ever would, but the psychological damage manifested in ways his doctors struggled to address. Insomnia kept him awake most nights, his mind replaying moments he couldn't change. His appetite had diminished to the point where maintaining weight required conscious effort. Chronic pain radiated through his body despite the medications designed to control it, a constant reminder of the October afternoon when his brakes had failed on a mountain road. His doctors suspected depression was accelerating a decline that might have been slower in a healthier mental state. They recommended various interventions throughout 2019 and into 2020. Changes in medication, intensive therapy programs, even a brief hospitalization when his weight dropped dangerously low. Raymond complied with most of their recommendations, going through the motions of treatment without any apparent belief that it would help. In the summer of 2020, his health took a more serious turn. Complications from his amputations led to infections that required multiple hospital stays. His heart, weakened by years of stress and declining physical condition, began showing signs of strain. His cardiologist used words like concerning and careful monitoring, while avoiding the more direct language that Raymond would have preferred. "Just tell me how long," Raymond said during one appointment. "I'm tired of pretending this is going somewhere good." The doctor couldn't give him a specific answer, but the look on his face communicated more than any words could have. The final conversation between Raymond and Diane took place on September 28, 2020, almost exactly 3 years after the crash that had destroyed his body and exposed the hollowness of the life he had chosen. He had called her to his home, asked her to sit with him in the living room where afternoon light filtered through windows that hadn't been cleaned in months. He was lucid, calm, and more at peace than she had seen him since before everything fell apart. "I need to say something," he told her, "and I need you to let me finish before you respond." Diane nodded, her hands folded in her lap, her expression carefully neutral. "I destroyed us," Raymond said. "I destroyed you, and I destroyed myself in the process. I can't undo any of it. I can't give you back the years or the trust or anything else. But I can tell you this. You were the best thing that ever happened to me, and I was too stupid to see it until it was too late. I don't expect forgiveness. I just needed you to know." Diane was quiet for a long moment, processing words she had waited years to hear. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady. "I forgave you a long time ago, Ray. Not for you. For me. So I could move forward." Raymond closed his eyes. "Thank you," he said. Raymond Allen Patterson died on October 12, 2020, in his Portland home, 3 years after the crash that should have killed him. The cause of death was cardiac arrest, though the doctors who had been monitoring his decline believed his heart had stopped working properly long before it officially gave out. Diane was with him at the end, along with Megan and Derek. All three of them gathered around the hospital bed that had been installed in his living room during his final weeks. He died surrounded by the family he had betrayed, the family that had come back anyway, the family that had refused to let him die alone, despite every reason they had to walk away. He was 53 years old. Gerald and Patricia Holt are buried side by side in a small cemetery overlooking Ashland, Oregon, the town where they raised their children, built their careers, and planned to spend their retirement years. Their gravestone bears an inscription their children selected together. Together in life, together in eternity. Every October 14th, Susan, Michael, and James Holt gather at that grave to mark the anniversary of their parents' deaths. They bring flowers. They share memories. They try to focus on how their parents lived rather than how they died. Susan Holt established a scholarship foundation in her parents' memory, providing financial support to students from Southern Oregon who want to become educators. "It's the only way I know how to make sense of it," she explained in an interview. "My father spent his career helping young people reach their potential. This foundation continues that work. It doesn't fix what happened. Nothing can fix what happened, but it creates something good from something terrible." Megan Patterson continues her nursing career in Portland, specializing in trauma care, a choice she made deliberately in the aftermath of her father's accident. She rarely discusses her family's story publicly, preferring to keep that chapter of her life compartmentalized from her professional identity. When patients or colleagues learn about her history, she deflects their curiosity with practiced grace. "Everyone has difficult things in their past," she says. "Mine just happened to make the news." She visits her father's grave twice a year, on his birthday and on the anniversary of his death. She has never visited Brittany Collins at Coffee Creek Correctional Facility and has no plans to do so. Some doors, once closed, are better left that way. Derek Patterson graduated with his business degree in the spring of 2021, completing his studies after his father's death with a determination that surprised even himself. He now operates a small property management company in Portland, a scaled-down version of the business his father built over decades. The company name isn't Patterson Properties, as one might expect. Derek named it Holt Properties, in honor of the innocent couple who died in the crash that was meant to kill his father. "I wanted something good to come from their names," he explained. "Gerald and Patricia Holt were strangers to me, but their deaths are connected to my family forever. This is my way of acknowledging that connection, of making sure their names mean something beyond how they died." Diane Patterson never remarried. She continued her real estate career, eventually becoming one of the top producing agents in the Portland market. She volunteers weekly at a domestic violence shelter, work she began after her divorce and has continued ever since. When asked about her decision to care for Raymond during his final years, she gives the same answer she has always given. "I didn't do it for him. I did it because of who I wanted to be. He made his choices. I made mine, and I can live with mine." Brittany Collins. Patterson remains incarcerated at Coffee Creek Correctional Facility, where she will spend the rest of her life. She was 22 years old when she married Raymond Patterson. She was 23 when she tried to kill him. She is now approaching 30, facing decades more behind bars, her dreams of wealth and adventure reduced to the dimensions of a prison cell. She never had children with Raymond, never created anything lasting from their brief and toxic union. There is no family to visit her, no legacy to carry forward. She has never expressed remorse for her crimes, not publicly, and not in any communications that have become part of the public record. Her statements at parole hearings, which are routinely denied, continue to focus on herself, her difficult childhood, her limited options, the circumstances that she claims led her to desperate actions. The Holt family attends every parole hearing to ensure their parents are not forgotten, to remind the board what Brittany's ambition cost two people who had never done her any harm. Tyler James Reeves serves his sentence at a separate facility, his fate intertwined with Brittany's, but his future equally certain. He will grow old in prison. He will die in prison. The shortcut to wealth he believed Brittany offered led only to a cell smaller than the apartment he once complained about. This story began with a betrayal. A man who threw away 22 years of marriage for a fantasy, who traded a wife who loved him for a woman who saw him only as a means to an end. It ended with death, imprisonment, and grief that will echo through multiple families for generations to come. Some stories don't have happy endings, but some stories have just endings, and perhaps this is one of them. Diane Patterson showed up for a man who didn't deserve her compassion. Her children showed up for a father who had failed them in almost every way a father can fail. And Raymond Patterson, in his final months, finally understood what he had thrown away. The woman who tried to kill him will spend the rest of her life in a prison cell, growing old in a place where dreams go to die. The woman he betrayed will spend the rest of her life free from bitterness, free from the anger she refused to let consume her, free from the man who never deserved her. What remains, in the end, is the same thing that remains after every tragedy: the choice of how to respond. Gerald and Patricia Holt's children chose to honor their parents' memory through service. Raymond Patterson's children chose to forgive a father who had wounded them deeply. Diane Patterson chose grace over vengeance, dignity over bitterness, the harder path that leads somewhere worth going. Those choices don't erase what happened. Nothing can erase what happened. But they do remind us that even in the aftermath of devastation, we get to decide who we become. And that choice, perhaps, is all any of us really have. Thanks for watching. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe for more stories like this one. Your support makes these documentaries possible,